Okay, so today I'm going to talk about joints. This is the other aspect of the skeletal system other than the bones themselves. So it typically gets its own chapter. In this case, it's chapter 9 in our free textbook. And we're going to go through kind of the same stuff about joints that we've gone through with other things. So we're going to start by looking at how we classify joints, and we're going to go on from there. So there's two different ways that we can classify joints. And let me make sure my pen's working. There we go. We have functional as well as structural classifications. So we're going to look at both of those. And then we're going to look at some examples of each of those types of joints. As we talked about last time, the technical term for a joint is an articulation, and that is defined as any place that two bones meet. So regardless of whether or not there's any sort of mobility between those two bones, if two bones come together, it is a joint. So we have three functional classifications, and we also have three structural classifications. We're going to go through the three functional ones first, and then we're going to look at the structural ones. Oh, let me do that. So the three functional ones are a Synarthrosis, Amphiarthrosis, and Diarthrosis. And then the structural classifications are fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. So in this case, functional means how much movement is possible between the two bones. And the structural classification is based on the type of tissue that connects the bones. So when we look at a functional classification, the first one on the list is a Synarthrosis. So arthrosis referring to joint, and syn means, not, or with, sorry, not, with or the same. So these are joints with no movement. So we call them immobile joints. And the most common place to see them is in the axial skeleton, which remember refers to the skull and the vertebrae and the rib cage. And that's because these are places where protection is the most important function of the skeletal system. And so we don't need movement here, we need really strong, reliable frames. So we have a picture of a skull here, and the joints connecting the different bones of the skull are all synarthroses, in that there really shouldn't be any movement in between them. Our second one is an amphiarthrosis. So when something is ambidextrous or amphibious, it tends to mean it can kind of go both ways. And here we have a limited mobility. So these are not mobile in the way we typically think of mobile joints, which is the type we'll talk about next, but there's some give there typically because the tissue connecting the two bones has some sort of a squish component to it. So the best example of an amphiarthrosis is these intervertebral discs that connect our vertebrae. So these guys are fibrocartilage. I mentioned them when we talked about different types of cartilage. And because cartilage is good at compression, we can get a little bit of movement across that joint because of the cartilage squishing. Not a ton of movement, just a little bit. When we want a joint that can move, we're going to have a diarthrotic joint. So a diarthrosis is a freely movable joint. Excuse me for just 1 second. So the diarthrotic joints are the kind that basically, if you think about a joint, if you think about, where two bones come together and there's movement, it's a diarthrotic joint. And there's actually additional categories to that, but we're going to talk about it later after we cover the structural categories. So this particular one is your hip. So we have talked about the head of the femur before. The head of the femur connects to this part of the pelvis at the acetabulum of the hip bone or the coxal bone. And obviously we have plenty of movement in our hips. All right, so then that's going to take us to 3 structural classifications. So the first one is fibrous joints. So we're going to look at the different types of fibrous joints, because for each of our structural classifications, there's actually some subtypes. And we're going to look at some examples as well, so that it's easier for you to remember which one's which. So fibrous joints are defined by collagen fibers being the structure that binds the bones together. So these are basically being connected by a little bit of fibrous connective tissue, dense fibrous connective tissue, because the collagen fibers are the majority of the connection. We actually have 3 types of fibrous joints. So we have sutures, we have Gomphoses, and we have Syndesmosis. And those are all the plural. So let's take a look at sutures. So sutures are specifically the joints between the bones of the skull. They are bound by very short collagen fibers. And if you look at a skull, the other thing you often see is that the bone edges are interlocking, because these are not mobile joints. So a suture is an example of a synarthrosis. So it has both a structural and functional classification. And it shares a name with when you have to sew somebody back together. We place sutures, you know, to hold skin together after a surgery or after an injury, because it has a similar appearance to it. It's also possible for sutures, so the connections between the bones of our skull, to mineralize and actually become a bone-to-bone connection. So bone itself is connecting it. And that's actually a common thing that happens to everybody as they get older. So the older you are, the more likely you are to have them. And then we changed the name because now it's not collagen fibers anymore. So we call that a Synostosis, because now there's bone connecting it. So that os or osteo comes into play. Now, obviously, we don't have these tightly interlocking suture joints when we're born. So when we're born and we're much smaller, there's much longer collagen fibers connecting the bones of our skull. And we call those areas fontanelles or soft spots, because those are the parts that are not providing as much protection to our brain inside. And of course, this is necessary because, first of all, our heads don't always fit that great through the birth canal. So we need babies to be able to be a little squishy to make it out. And then the other thing is that brains grow during childhood, especially in the first few years. And so we need that skull to be expandable. And then once the brain and the skull get to basically to an adult size, then those collagen fibers can shrink and the fontanelles can close, and then we end up with actual sutures. So this particular one is showing you the sutures between some of the major skull bones. We're looking at this skull from above, and it's showing you 2 of the major fontanelles, which are where 3 different bone edges are coming together. And this one I like because it really shows you the interlocking nature of the skull bones once the sutures have fully formed. So the last fibrous joint type is called a syndesmosis. And this des, or DESM, I guess, the desmo, we use it when we want to talk about things like ligaments, and it typically refers to things that are rich in collagen fibers. So this is sort of our most generalized fibrous joint. The sutures and the one I'm about to talk about next are very specific, but otherwise, if it's collagen fibers, it's a syndesmosis. The big difference here between this and sutures is that the fibers are longer, and so we get a little bit of mobility in these joints. So they're typically what we call the Amphiarthrosis. And some of them are quite big, so there's collagen fibers all down the connection between the radius and the ulna, for example. And we call it the interosseous membrane, but it is actually a syndesmosis. It's actually a joint down the entire length of those bones, joining them together. Excuse me, and there are others like that as well. So here's a couple in your leg. So there's an interosseous membrane between the tibia and the fibula as well. And then at your ankle, on the lateral or outside portion of your ankle, there are some fairly long ligaments joining the bones together there as well. So that also forms a syndesmosis. So literally anywhere where we have long collagen fibers joining two bones together, we have a syndesmosis. And then this is the actual last fibrous joint. I don't know why I thought I got there already, but a gomphosis, which I know is a really weird word. And when I looked it up, it turns out that gomphosis really just means peg in Greek. We call them a peg and socket joint. And these are exclusively referring to the joints between teeth and the holes in our jaw bones that the teeth sit in. So there are short little collagen fibers that are called the periodontal ligament that sit between the teeth and the alveolus, which is what we call the little bone hole. And so peg and socket is the other term we see for it. These are pretty much immobile. Some sources say there's a little teeny tiny bit of movement, which I think is just to help you not break teeth when you bite really hard things, but these are essentially immobile. And because it's teeth, they got a different name than the sutures connecting the skull bones. So two that are very, very specific, sutures and gomphoses, and then syndesmosis for any other situation where two bones are connected by collagen fibers. So here's a summary of the three types. We have sutures, we have syndesmoses, and we have gomphoses. So the second category by structure is the cartilaginous joints. So we're going to look at the features of those. There's only two types, so we'll talk about which one's which, and we'll look at examples again so that it's easier to remember. So the two types we have are synchondroses, that's the plural with synchondrosis as a singular, and then symphyses, again, the plural where symphysis is the singular. Now, the distinction between these two types of joints is the type of cartilage being used. And depending on the joint, these can either have no movement at all, be a synarthrosis, or have a little bit. We've already talked about the major example of an amphiarthrotic cartilaginous joint, but we're going to look at it again. So a synchondrosis is marked by having hyaline cartilage as the connecting tissue. So remember that hyaline cartilage is the type where you can't see any type of fibers in the extracellular matrix, although they are there. And there's actually two subcategories of hyaline joints. So we have temporary ones, which are the growth plates that we learned about last time. Those are there during the period of growth, and because there is cartilage between the epiphysis of the bone and the diaphysis of the bone, it's technically a joint. But then that, of course, closes, and it becomes a Synostosis. And now we consider this all one bone. And then we do have some permanent ones, not very many, but the cartilage connection between our first rib, so we have a left and a right first rib up here, and they connect to our sternum or our breastbone. That is a hyaline cartilage connection for some weird reason. These are always completely immobile. So there's Synarthroses, so no mobility across hyaline cartilage. Now we can contrast this with the other type after I point out that it's that guy there. We can contrast that after I finish showing you all the pictures that I forgot I put in because I like pictures. That's where the growth plate closes and we get a Synostosis here with a symphysis. So with a symphysis, we have fibrocartilage instead of hyaline cartilage. So our fibrocartilage is the toughest, sturdiest type of cartilage that's best able to resist tensile and compressive forces. And we have a couple of places where fibrocartilage connects bones to each other. One we've already talked about, the intervertebral discs, which here is again the picture of that. And then this is showing you the disc head on. It's actually these crazy rings of fibrocartilage. And then the middle is actually a pulpy, sort of gelatinous, squishy substance, which helps with the slight mobility that we see at these discs. The other one is the pubic symphysis. So this connects the two sides of the pelvis together in the front or anteriorly, which I have a picture of. So the pubic symphysis is right here. And that is, again, also fibrocartilage. There's not typically a ton of mobility, but under the influence of the hormones of late pregnancy, we will see a loosening of that joint to help the birth canal be expansive and facilitate childbirth. So then our third structural option is synovial joints. And synovial joints are a little bit more complicated, so we're going to go into a little bit more detail. All right, so the reason why synovial joints are more complicated is because these are the joints that are fully movable. So these are also diarthroses. And so the structural category of synovial joint is completely overlapped with the functional category of a fully movable joint. Every joint that's synovial is diarthrotic, and every diarthrotic joint is synovial. The thing that makes it unique is that there's a fluid-filled cavity between the bone ends. So we're going to look at the basic components of that, and then we're going to look at the types of movement that are possible because of it. All right, so here is a classic synovial joint. So we have one bone end here, we have another bone end here. Now there is hyaline cartilage coating the end of the bone where it is inside of the joint space. So we also call that articular cartilage. And it's always hyaline cartilage. It's actually one of the most abundant locations of hyaline cartilage is across the joints. There's an articular capsule of connective tissue surrounding the joint. There's a space or cavity inside filled with fluid, which we call synovial fluid. Now, this fluid provides nutrition to the cartilage, but its main job is as a lubricant. So it makes everything really smooth. It reduces friction so that joint movement is painless. There's also always going to be ligaments across these joints because ligaments are needed to connect the bones to each other, even though there's this synovial cavity in between. So don't get confused between the fact that we have joints that are connected only by ligaments versus synovial joints also having ligaments, okay? This is a feature of a synovial joint, but it's not the only thing connecting the bones. So not all joints are that straightforward. Some of them are a little bit more complicated. So there are some additional things that we find in a lot of the joints in the body. And the reason why is because we want the bone ends to fit together well. And the other reason is that we want to keep reducing friction. So one of the things we see in certain joints is fibrocartilage within the joint. So they are fibrocartilage pads. They let the bones fit together better. And because fibrocartilage is good at compression, they're good for shock absorption. The most well-known fibrocartilage pads are the menisci in the knees. And other joints have them as well, but they're only called menisci in the knees. Other places we call them articular discs. And that's because most of them are kind of, disc-shaped or round, but the ones in the knees are kind of moon-shaped instead. And so they got a special name because of that. In addition to fibrocartilage pads, we also have additional fluid-filled structures that help reduce friction. So a bursa is the plural, or sorry, is the singular, or bursae is the plural, is literally just like, it's like a little water balloon. So it's a flattened fibrous sac. So this is, an outside covering of fibrous connective tissue, just like a joint capsule. And inside there's synovial fluid, the same type of lubricating fluid we find in the joints. And we'll see it located where structures might be rubbing together across the joint. So for the most part, this is to prevent friction of structures running over the joint as they potentially rub on bone. So we're padding between bone and other things. This could be ligaments, this could be skin, this could be tendons. And then for some tendons, there's a lot of mobility, and a bursa isn't enough to reduce the friction. So we'll end up with a sheath, a tendon sheath, where the bursa is basically wrapped all the way around the tendon as it runs over the joint. There's probably an exception there. We say it's where they are subjected to friction, but that basically means over joints. So these three structures really help the function of a lot of joints. And this is a, let's see, it's a sagittal view of the knee. So sliced down, down from front to back. So this is the patella here. And these are your quads. This is the femur. This is the tibia. So this is the synovial joint here. And aside from the patella, which adds complications as it is, we also have the menisci, which they drew in right here. There's some ligaments inside the joint. Those are what your cruciates are. They're ligaments inside the joint. There's a bursa here to protect the patellar ligament as it comes down over the joint. There's a bursa here to protect the skin over the patella. There's a bursa here to protect this tendon as it runs over the femur. So there's lots of these extra structures because the knee is subject to a lot of issues because it doesn't fit super well together and it has a lot of movement, and so it's prone to injury. There's even fat behind your kneecap there to provide extra padding. Oh, sorry about that. That was weird. Okay. Let's see. So that is the anatomy. So now what we're going to look at is how synovial joints are able to move. And we'll talk a little bit more about movement when we get to the muscular system. but we like to start by looking at what the joints can do. And so when we talk about movement of synovial joints, what we mean is that we have muscles attaching to the bones across the joint. And when they contract, when they shorten, it's going to pull on one bone and move it at the location of the joint. How much movement a joint has, so its range of motion, depends on a lot of factors that affect stability. So this is things like how the bones fit together, how tight the ligaments are, how much extra tissue is around, stuff like that. So because of those factors, not all joints have the same range of motion or the same types of motion. So we're going to talk about the categories that we can put these joints into based on that kind of movement. The first way we categorize is by the plane in which the joint is able to move, or how many planes. And so when we talk about planes, we're talking about three-dimensional space. So we can, that didn't work. We can represent that with like a little 3-axis graph thing here, right? So if this is somebody's body, their head, and their legs go this way, their arms hopefully don't actually go that way, we can see that this corresponds to the 3 planes of the body that we learned in the first lecture. So we have, we have a frontal plane, and we have a sagittal plane, and we have a transverse plane. So if a joint moves in one of those planes, we say it's monoaxial. If it can move in any 2 of them, we say it's biaxial. And if it's capable of moving in all 3 planes, then we say it's multiaxial. So monoaxial could be movement in any of one of these planes. So it could be sagittal or horizontal or frontal. But it can also just be the ability to rotate. So rotation also counts as a monoaxial joint, even if it's not moving within the plane, which is a little weird, but that's how they decided to categorize them. Biaxial means you can move in 2 of those planes, or you can move in 1 plane and you can rotate, which I don't think actually exists, but technically it's a possibility. And then multiaxial is being able to move in all 3 planes, and you probably can rotate if you can do that too, because that means you have a lot of mobility. So this diagram is showing you different examples of those things, and we're going to cover them more in a second. But here, for example, we have a uniplanar or uniaxial movement at the elbow. So the elbow can just do this, up and down. Here we're looking at what you can do with your fingers at the knuckle joints. It's a biaxial movement because you can move this way and that way, front and back and side to side. And then the shoulder is a great example of, they have triaxial, but we're going to use multiaxial, of a multiaxial joint because it can move all 3 planes and it can rotate. Now, it's not enough, of course, to categorize them by the planes in which they move. We also classify synovial joints by the shape of the bones. And while that sounds weird, it's because the shape of the bones as they come together is the biggest factor in determining range of motion. So each of these joint types has a different number of planes in which it can move. And so this is how we can more formally talk about monoaxial, biaxial, and multiaxial joints. So we're going to work our way through these one at a time with examples, and hopefully it'll make sense. So the first one is a plane joint. Now, plane joints are weird because it's where 2 flat surfaces come together. And when you have flat surfaces, they can't really do much. Their only option is to slide back and forth. So we call that gliding. and it's actually a non-axial movement. So we see this in the ankles and the wrists. So specifically, we see this happening between the tarsal bones and the carpal bones, because we have these short little bones, and there's a bunch of them, and they're all tightly attached to each other. And so when there's movement across those joints and the joints next to them that have more range of motion, all they can do is just kind of shift in relation to each other. And that's why they're more there for stabilizing the joints rather than enhancing joint movement. So the plane joints are really only found at the ankles and the wrists. Pivot joints are also weird. So if something is able to pivot, it means it's rotating. And so pivot joints are where you have a bone that's basically cylindrical, long up and down, and it fits into another bone, and then typically there's a ligament completing that circle, so that you really are holding that bone, and so now its only option is rotation. And that sounds very limiting, but it's actually quite useful. So one of the places we have that is called the atlantoaxial joint. It's the joint between the first and second vertebrae in our neck. And it's the reason why we can say no without words. So that pivot allows us to shake our heads. And then another one that we have is in the proximal radio-ulnar joints. And so that is where the radius and the ulna come together up here by the elbow. And because of that joint, we can turn our palm back and forth, which we're going to look at in a little bit for some movement stuff. So that's pivot joints. It's monoaxial, but all it does is rotation. When we want to look at, oh right, I have this. So here's another pivot, and this is the atlantoaxial joint. There's this little piece of bone that sits here, and then this ligament holds it in. So this is the sleeve, and this is the cylinder, and so that allows rotation. So when it comes to actual like movement in a plane, when we have monoaxial movement, one of the ways we do that is with a hinge joint. So it's called a hinge for the same reason why we talk about door hinges. It has one type of movement. So we describe the bone ends as a convex bone end. So this guy is convex, rounded and poking out, fitting inside of a concave bone end. So here's our little concave guy here. And so that basically locks it in. And this is the only movement available. It's typically too wide to allow for any other movement. We have a lot of hinge joints. So our elbows are hinge joints. Our knees are hinge joints, although there is a little more movement there. Our ankles, and then interphalangeal is the joints between your fingers. So all of those guys are hinge as well. So they only can move in one plane. So there's a little elbow diagram there, and you can see the hinge movement in that little GIF. Oh, come on. There we go. This one's a knee. I showed you this picture before. So the knee is technically a modified hinge, and it's modified because it's not quite as locked in. It's not really monoaxial, but it's still a hinge. So we do have a little bit of side-to-side movement we can do with our knees, and so it's a rule breaker, and that's one of the reasons why it's so prone to injury, because it has a little bit too much movement to it. So here is a couple of other GIFs. So these are basically X-ray videos that were taken of somebody moving their ankle here and moving their elbow. So you can kind of see that hinge action. This one's nice because you can also see some gliding movement in these short bones here. the hinge is up here. And then here's the knee, which is fun because you can see the patella moving. All right, so that's our monoaxial joints. We have a couple of biaxial joints, or joints that can move in 2 planes. And one of them is called a condylar joint. So a condyle is literally just a rounded joint end. It's kind of an oval shape. So here, again, we have kind of this rounded convex bone end fitting into a rounded concave bone end. In this case, it's a fossa, which remember means a shallow depression. And so these guys have 2 planes of movement, and the places where we see condyle joints are the knuckle joints. So down here between your hand and your fingers, and technically down in your toes too, and then in your wrists are some common locations. So another one is actually your jaw joint. So it's called your temporomandibular joint. You may have seen it abbreviated as the TMJ. And so you can do that, right? And like that. Okay, so 2 planes. So this one is not great, but I tried. These are your condylar joints here. And they're not really doing movements that let you see it, but it can move 2 ways, which you know, because you can move your fingers that way. There we go. Now there's another type of biaxial joint. It's called a saddle joint. And the reason why we have these 2 different biaxial joints is because the joint shapes are so different from each other. So in this case, they fit together in sort of this fashion. And so when one joint end moves, you get one plane of movement. And when the other one moves, you get the other plane of movement. Somebody thought it looked like a saddle sitting on a horse, which I disagree with immensely, but nobody asked me, so we're stuck with it. The best example of a saddle joint in the body is actually the joint at the base of the thumb. So here is the joint that we're talking about. So it gives you a slightly different type of movement than what we have at the knuckles. And that's your GIF showing you what saddle joints can do. So you can see we get the same planes of movement, but it happens in a slightly different way. All right, so then our last one is the only type of joint that's multiaxial. And it's called a ball and socket joint because we have this rounded bone end that we call a head, which acts as a ball, and it fits into a completely rounded concave cavity that we call a socket. So ball and socket joint. The only places where we have this in the body are the hip joints and the shoulder joints. And so the only multi-axial joints we have are the hips and the shoulders. So these guys are capable of moving in all 3 planes, and they're capable of rotation. So this is a diagram of the shoulder where you can really see how the head of the shoulder fits. And the socket is actually quite shallow. It's called the glenoid cavity here at the scapula. But that's nice for range of mobility because we have a lot of movement that we can do at our shoulder. Here's a GIF of that. Nice rotation there. And all the way around. Okay, and then the hip. So here's the head of the femur. Here's the socket, which we call the acetabulum. It's a bit deeper, and so it's a tighter fit, and our range of mobility is actually less at the hip than it is at the shoulder. But that's good because the downside to having a really high range of mobility is the risk of dislocation. So it's a lot easier to dislocate or, you know, get that head of the humerus out of the socket than it is to dislocate your femur at your hip joint. And since our femurs are kind of holding up all of our body weight, we don't want it to be easily dislocated. So there is a price to pay for range of motion. So places where we need more strength and sturdiness are typically more restricted in their range of motion than places that don't have that need and can therefore be more mobile. So the last thing we're going to talk about is how we define the actual movements. So we've talked about the movements that different joints are capable of, but we haven't actually talked about what we call these movements in the different planes of the body. So that's what we're going to finish with, is the actual body movements. And if you go into any sort of kinesiology, physical therapy, PE, anything like that, these are the most likely parts that you're gonna encounter. So this is a video. I don't know what'll happen if I do it like this. Let's find out. This could go horribly wrong and you might have to, oh, okay then. Let me do this and then take you to this. I think that's going to be the best way to do it. I don't need notifications. I was pretty sure that there were sound here. Okay, I'm gonna let you guys watch that on your own if you want, because this is kind of going more through what we've already talked about. Seemed like a good idea at the time. And we're gonna go back to that. Okay, so when we look at body movements, we're going back to those same three planes we talked about, right? Sagittal, frontal, transverse, and we're going back to that anatomic position. So remember that the anatomic position is standing with your palms forward, arms by your side, head forward. When people talk about movement, they refer to the anatomical position as zero position, and movement is therefore always going to be either away from the anatomical position or back to the anatomical position. And because you're always moving away from or back to, this lets movements get paired together. So one movement goes one way and the other one returns it. So we'll look at some examples of that and the other types. So we can split them up basically based on the plane of movement. So gliding movement, angular movement, and then rotation. So you can see these are the ones where we're actually moving within a plane, the other two are not. So gliding movements are basically going to occur with plane joints, and it's the gliding that we already talked about, right? So it's that non-axial movement where the bones just slide past each other. So that one's pretty straightforward. Where it gets a little more complex is the angular movements. So the angular movements are when we're actually changing the angle between two bones in a plane of the body. And the word we use for the change in angle depends on which plane of the body we're changing it in. So flexion and extension are the most common ones that we have. And this is where we are moving in the sagittal plane. Flexion decreases the angle between two bones, and extension increases the angle. Now, most joints are already extended in the anatomical position. So flexion typically moves the bone or moves the joint away from the anatomical position. Extension will return you to the anatomical position, or it can continue to increase the angle beyond it, depending on the joint. Not all joints are capable of extending beyond the anatomical position. Your elbow is a really good example. It's fully extended in the anatomical position. You can flex out of that, and then you can extend back, but you can't extra extend at your elbow. It does not do that. So here we have some different body parts, flexing and extending. So you can see we've got flexion and extension at the shoulder, flexion and extension at the knee. This is showing you that it's not exclusive to the appendicular skeleton. So it's not just our arms and legs that do this. We can do this with our whole body. We can do this with our head at our neck. So flexion would be, dropping your chin to your chest. Extension would be returning your head upright or dropping the back of your head to your back. Okay, so you can see how we're moving in the sagittal plane, right? We're kind of going either anteriorly or posteriorly and changing those angles. Now, if we want, so here we have, this is how we can flex and extend at the waist. So the entire vertebral column comes into play there. Now, if we want to work in the frontal plane, so side to side, basically, we call it abduction and adduction. So these are tricky because they're so similar to each other. So it might help if you say abduction, which is movement of the body away from midline. So midline is the middle and you're moving away. And then adduction with a D is when you return the body part towards midline, move it back towards midline. So again, most body parts are already adducted with a D in anatomical position. So abduction is going to move them away from anatomical and adduction is going to return it. So it can be tricky to remember these. So there's a couple ways to do it. You really only have to use one. If you can remember one, you can remember the other one's the opposite. So I kind of like to do the whole that looks like a whatever. Hold on, let me try that again. Abduction is when you get abducted by aliens. I've never tried to draw a little UFO before, but it didn't work at all. Let's just do this. And then adduction is when you're adding the body part back to the core of the body. So whichever way works for you, or come up with your own to help you remember those guys. But either way, you can see we're moving in the frontal plane, away from midline, and then back towards it. So our third category is rotation. And we define rotation as spinning on the longitudinal axis. So longitudinal referring to the length. So this is something we need long bones for the most part. And when we have limbs that do this, when we're rotating at the shoulders or the hips, which are the places that we can rotate our limbs, we can rotate them two directions, right? So internal rotation is defined as when the anterior or the front aspect of the bone moves medially. So that's like when you want to, if you're standing in the anatomical position and you want to make your toes move towards each other, you would be internally rotating both your legs. And then external rotation is when the anterior aspect of the bones moves laterally. So like if you wanted your heels to touch and your toes to point outwards, that would be external rotation of your legs. So if you're using the axial skeleton to rotate, then it's just rotation. You can rotate your head at the neck to the left or to the right. But if you're rotating a limb, than when this front or lateral aspect, or sorry, anterior aspect goes this way, it's external. And when it goes this way, it's internal. And you can see this one uses medial and lateral, which are probably better. There are actually a lot of special movements too, things that don't fit into any of those categories. Some of them are listed in your book, and we're not going to go over all of them, but I did want to cover just a couple of fairly common's the wrong word, but I don't know, a couple of them because they're kind of classic. So we're going to talk about pronation and supination, and then we're going to talk about opposition. So the thing that makes them special is that there's very specific places these occur with, and they're not as generalized as the other movements. So supination and pronation are movements only your forearm can do. So supination is how you are when you're in the anatomical position. So the palms of your hands are facing anteriorly. Pronation is when you turn just your forearm, not up here, when you turn that so that your palms face posteriorly. So here is a GIF of that. And so this is occurring at that proximal radial ulnar joint that we looked at before, which is that pivot joint. And so the bones literally cross over each other when you're pronated, and they're parallel to each other when you're supinated, which is really probably why supinated is the anatomical position in the first place, because it's certainly not natural for us to stand there with our palms facing forward. It's far more natural for us to stand with our palms facing backwards. But if we do that, then the anatomical position would have our bones crossed, and that just seems weird. So that's pronation and supination, very, very specific. Although we do use those words in different places. So when you're laying down, we use prone and supine to mention which part of your body is facing up or down. So the supine position is when the anterior aspect of your body is facing up and the posterior aspect of your body is lying on the ground. And the prone position is when the anterior part of your body is on the ground and the posterior part of your body is facing up. So that's kind of the same concept. And unfortunately, they really don't make very good diagrams for that. So all I have is these creepy Wikipedia pictures. So the last one that we're going to talk about is opposition. And I left in this one too, because this is just a nice example of the fact that even though we could define these movements in a general way, somebody decided to give them special definitions. So the way that you move your wrists. So when we're in the anatomical position, just pretend I am. So I can move my wrists like this, right? And if I am in the anatomical position where my thumbs are facing farther from my body, if I move like that, I'm abducting my hand at the wrist. And if I move them back this way, I'm adducting my hand at the wrist because I'm moving it closer to midline. But some people aren't happy with that. So instead, they decided to use ulnar flexion when you move your pinky closer to your ulna, and radial flexion when you move your thumb closer to your radius. It's very, very stupid, but it exists, so I point it out. Now, opposition is how we have opposable thumbs. It's the word we use referring to the fact that our thumbs can touch our other fingertips. And technically, reposition is what we call it when it goes back, but I don't care about that. Nobody cares about being repositionable. Opposable is the important one. So this is just showing you the radial ulnar flexion, which is stupid, but this is the interesting one. So we're, of course, not the only ones with opposable thumbs. So all of our closest ape cousins have opposable thumbs, although you can see how much smaller that thumb is in proportion to the fingers versus the human. So tells you the relative importance probably of that. And again, it just means that you can touch fingertips because none of your other fingers can do that. And it's super important because otherwise you can't grip things. Now, they have the advantage over us in that they have opposable toes too. So the big toe on our primate cousins is also opposable, whereas ours has evolved for walking more, and now it just goes straight forward. So most of us don't have, I assume none of us have, I don't know. People tend not to have opposable toes, we just have the opposable thumbs. So this is a gorilla versus a person, and these are the skeletal pictures of the same thing. You can see how that looks very much like a hand on the gorilla's foot. Okay, so the point here was to look at structural as well as functional classifications of joints. When we look at structural classifications, we have 3 kinds of fibrous joints, 2 kinds of cartilaginous joints, and we have 6 types of synovial joints based on the shape of the bones at the joint surface. And then we have 3 categories of body movements, right? We have gliding, we have angular, and we have rotation. So if you have any questions about this, we can certainly discuss it on Monday before we start talking about muscle. And you can also email me at any point for clarification. All right. Was it right? Yep. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's cool. Let's stop recording, shall we?